In 210 BC, an emperor sent 3,000 children out to sea. He sent them to find the cure for death. Not one of them was ever seen again. The man who led them wasn't a sailor or a general. He was a court magician, and the records of the time don't read like the story of a fleet that sank. They read like the story of a man who got away. Decades later, a condemned official stood in a courtroom in the South and said one sentence about where those ships had really gone. And that single sentence is why some historians no longer read this as a shipwreck at all, but as an escape. I'll get to what he said, because this didn't start with the ocean. It started with one piece of paper, and a deal no one in the empire was built to survive. His name was Ying Zheng, though the world had agreed to call him the first emperor. He'd swallowed 6 rival kingdoms and fused them into one state, and he ruled 20 million people from a throne nobody could approach without permission. And he was losing a war. Not against an army, against his own body. He drank elixirs laced with mercury because his physicians swore the metal would make him live forever, and the mercury was quietly poisoning him to death. And he was the one man in the empire too frightened and too powerful for anyone to tell. No state had ever run this tight. The empire moved on standardized coins and a single code of law across 36 provinces. Its roads cut dead straight. Its crossbow parts filed so the trigger of one would drop into another. 20 million lives turning like one mechanism. And for a generation, nothing on earth could touch it. He'd done it by force. He'd made the whole country speak one language and use one coin and one length of ruler. The way you'd reformat 100 mismatched machines to run a single piece of software. And if a machine wouldn't run the software, he scrapped it. In 219 BC, the emperor came east to the coast, to the great port of Langia, and there, a magician promised him the one thing the mercury couldn't. Out past the eastern sea, the magician said, were 3 islands where immortals lived, and on those islands grew the herb that ended death. His name was Su Fu. Call him the Wizard. The emperor handed him ships, money, and men, and sent him over the horizon to bring the herb home. The islands weren't there. The wizard sailed, found open water and empty rock, and came back with nothing. And here's the part the fairy tale version skips. Under the law of the Iron Tyrant, coming back with nothing was a death sentence. A state contract under this regime worked like a loan from a man who also happened to own all the courts. You took the job, and if you didn't deliver, the penalty wasn't a fine or a demotion or a strongly worded letter. It was a pit in the ground with your name on it. The wizard had taken the largest contract in the empire and failed it. By the empire's own rules, he was already a dead man walking the docks. He knew exactly what happened to magicians who failed this emperor because he'd watched it. 2 of the court's other sorcerers had taken the same job, chasing the same cure, and when they came up empty, they didn't stay to explain. They denounced the emperor to his face for his cruelty, and they ran. And what the emperor did next tells you precisely what kind of man was holding the wizard's contract. He rounded up the scholars of the capital, the men of letters he blamed for the magician's lies, and he had a great pit dug in a valley outside the city. The histories put the number at 460 and say almost nothing about what was done at the edge of it, only that none of them came back. The silence in the record is its own kind of answer. That is what total power does when reality won't cooperate. It can't punish the thing that actually failed it, death, the ocean, the islands that were never there. So it punishes whoever's standing closest to the failure instead. So when the wizard came back to court in 210 BC with no herb and no excuse, he understood his position perfectly. He had exactly one move left. He had to make the emperor want to send him away again. So he lied. Beautifully. He didn't deny the islands. He'd reached them, he told the emperor. He'd seen the immortals. He'd been close enough to smell the cure. But the path was blocked. A giant sea creature, a monster the size of a warship, guarded the approach and turned his fleet back every single time. Give him a second expedition, a larger one, and the firepower to get past the beast, and he'd finally bring the herb home. That lie does something clever. It takes the emperor's real problem, there is no cure, you are going to die, and quietly swaps it for a different one. There's a cure, and it's guarded by a fish. The first problem is hopeless. The second one has a solution. And a man drowning in his own mortality will always reach for the version of reality that lets him keep hoping. That's the trap the Iron Tyrant had built for himself without ever noticing. When you execute the people who bring you bad news, the only news that survives the trip to your throne is the news someone thinks you want to hear. He'd spent years making honesty fatal. The wizard simply handed him the lie his whole court had been trained to tell. And the emperor believed him, so completely that he decided to go kill the monster himself. Picture this, the deck of the imperial barge, summer of 210 BC. The wind comes hard off the eastern sea, and it stinks of salt and rotting weed. The emperor stands braced at the rail, thin now and gray, the mercury showing in his skin, with a heavy crossbow cranked and mounted at his side. The water heaves. Something dark breaks the surface near the rocks of Mount Jifu, and the trigger releases with a low thrum, and the bolt goes home, and the sea around the ship turns red. He'd killed a large fish, a shark, most likely, or something close to it. He had the weapon and the will to fight death itself, and the best he managed was to put a bolt through a fish and have it called a triumph, which the court duly recorded as one, because the alternative was telling him otherwise. With the path cleared, the wizard named his price for the second voyage, and his shopping list is the confession. He didn't ask for soldiers. He didn't ask for warships full of marines to fight off more monsters. He asked for 3,000 noble children, boys and girls. He asked for 500 master craftsmen, weavers, metalworkers, shipwrights, farmers. He asked for grain seed, millet, rice, barley. He asked for plows. Think about that. Lay that manifest out on a table. Children, to grow up and have children of their own. Craftsmen, who can build anything from nothing. Seed and tools to put food in the ground. That is not the supply list for a quick trip to fetch a magic herb and sail home. A man can lie with his mouth. A cargo hold can't. It carries exactly what you actually intend, packed and counted. And this one was packed with everything you need to start a civilization, and nothing you need to ever come back. He wasn't loading ships to find immortality for someone else. He was loading ships to vanish. And in the late summer of 210 BC, in front of thousands of weeping families on the shore at Langya, that is precisely what he did. "60 ships, 3,000 children, one direction." It's dawn in the docks at Langya. The big tower ships sit low and heavy in the water, loaded with grain and tools and people, and the oars come down in slow rhythm and drag them out past the breakwater. On the decks, 3,000 children watch the only world they've ever known shrink to a thin gray line, and then to nothing at all. Behind them, the imperial horns are still sounding from the shore. Ahead of them is open ocean, and a man who already knows they are never going home. The fleet sailed east, past the horizon, and straight out of the records of China. The emperor never found out how the story ended. That same autumn, traveling the dusty roads back toward his capital, The man who had spent a fortune chasing eternal life died of the mercury he'd been drinking to find it. He was 49. His death had to be hidden to stop a power grab. The journey home took weeks, and it was high summer, so his advisors packed the imperial carriage with carts of rotting salted fish and drove the most powerful corpse on earth back to the capital, buried inside the stench so the guards would smell only spoiled seafood and never the dead emperor. I had to check that one against the record to be sure. The man who chased the purest thing imaginable, life without end, came home smelling of rotting fish. The terror of death hadn't bought him a single extra day. It had emptied his treasury, killed his scholars, and handed his alchemist the ships to sail away on. Fear that absolute doesn't buy you safety. It buys the exit for whoever's clever enough to take it. And the wizard? Where he ended up, the records barely whisper. Somewhere east, somewhere fertile. Then nothing. No letter, no fleet limping home, no word at all. That's where the trail went cold, and it stayed cold for a very long time. A fleet leaves, a fleet vanishes, and you're free to believe whatever you like. That they drowned, that they starved, that the sea simply took them. A clean, sad shipwreck. Except for one man, decades later, in a courtroom in the South. Here's what he said. About a century after the fleet disappeared, a rebellion was brewing in the empire's successor state, and a minister named Wu Bei was hauled in and questioned. Arguing against a doomed revolt, he reached back for a cautionary example and laid out the Su Fu expedition in flat, administrative language, the way you'd describe a transaction. The emperor sent Su Fu to sea for spirits and treasures. Su Fu came back and lied about why he'd failed. The overjoyed emperor sent him out again, with the children and the craftsmen. And then Wu Bei said the line that turns everything over. Su Fu reached a place of flat plains and wide swamps, made himself king there, and never came back. To the people in that room, this wasn't a fable about magic islands. It was a fact everyone already half knew. The man took the emperor's children, the emperor's gold, and the emperor's craftsmen, sailed somewhere safe, and set up his own kingdom beyond the reach of the imperial sword. I read that passage twice the first time, just to be sure I had it right. It isn't framed as a mystery. It's framed as something that obviously happened. This is what historians now call the escape hypothesis. The voyage was never a sacrifice to a sea god. The monster was never real. The cure was never the point. It was a prison break dressed up as a holy mission, financed by the very tyrant it was escaping, and the 3,000 children were the disguise. A fleet of soldiers fleeing east looks like treason. A fleet of children sent to beg an herb from the gods looks like devotion. He didn't bring the children to save them, and he didn't bring them to sacrifice them. He brought them because they made the escape look like a prayer. And those children, take a real second on that number, because it's so easy to let it slide past as scenery. 3,000. Sons and daughters pulled from the empire's leading families, loaded onto ships, and sailed away from every grandparent, every home, every name they had ever owned. Not as passengers, and not as victims of a storm, but as living camouflage for one man's way out. 3,000 childhoods spent in full to make a lie look like faith. Here's the thing the man who ran could never have known. He was trying to disappear. Instead, he sailed straight into the leading edge of something enormous. The centuries around his voyage were the front of a mass migration off the Asian mainland onto the islands to the east. Wave after wave of farmers and metalworkers and their families crossing the same water his fleet crossed. And that migration left a signature you can still read today. written in the one archive no empire gets to edit. In 2021, scientists sequenced the genomes of ancient and modern people from those islands, and the DNA stacks up like sediment in a riverbed, each migration laying down its own band of color, one on top of the last. Cut a core sample straight down through modern Japan, and you find 3 bands: a thin old layer from the original hunter-gatherers, a layer from the first rice farmers, and on top, the thick dominant band, about 70%, left by a massive wave of mainland arrivals closely related to the people of the Yellow River, flooding in right around the era the wizard sailed. No one can prove his single fleet started that wave, but that's almost beside the point. He sailed to erase himself from his own country, and the water carried him into the bloodline of another one. He ran to vanish, and the migration he rode at its very front is now written into the genomes of more than 100 million people alive today. Today, in a town called Shingu on the coast of Wakayama, there's a grave that people still visit where they leave flowers for a Chinese alchemist they call the god of farming, medicine, and silk, the patron saint of the exact man who was running for his life. And growing wild on the mountains all around that grave is a glossy evergreen shrub that isn't native to Japan. It came from China, from the same slopes the wizard sailed away from. In the old story, it was the magic herb of immortality itself, his cover, the fairy tale plant he'd been sent to find. Modern chemists pulled apart its roots, expecting nothing, and found a real cardiovascular medicine, compounds that lower blood pressure, calm the nerves, and steady the heart. The cure for death was always a lie. The plant he used to sell that lie turned out to be real medicine. And the shrub is still there, glossy and evergreen, rooting through the mountainside above his headstone. The fake cure that turned out to be real, growing quietly over the grave of a man who fled an empire 2,000 years ago and was never caught. The emperor chased life forever and got a secret death on a dusty road and a carriage full of rotting fish. The man who only wanted out got a kingdom, a legend, and a real medicine growing over his bones. He was never trying to be remembered. He just didn't want to die in that pit. And of the two of them, he's the one the living still bring flowers to.